For our next talk, I welcome Dr. Jonathan Raykantal. Dr. Jonathan is the former Chief Information Officer for the city of Palo Alto in California and a multiple award-winning technology leader whose 30-year career has spanned both in the private and public sector. In 2017, he was named one of the top 100 CIOs in the world, and in 2016, he was named one of the top 20 most influential CIOs in the United States. Let's all welcome Dr. Jonathan.
Okay, let's do this. Thank you. Whew. Okay. So just about 200 years ago, there was a job called a waker-upper. And as you can probably imagine, the job of the waker-upper was to wake people up. And the way they did that was with a stick, and they would knock on the window, right? Sometimes they also had a pea shooter, for real, right? And you might think, why is that? Well, because a couple of hundred years ago, during the sort of first/second industrial revolution, alarm clocks weren't that common, especially electrical ones, right? And of the ones that existed, they weren't very reliable. By the way, the waker-upper also did something else. The waker-upper would light the oil in the evening for the street lights, and then in the morning they would extinguish them. Lots of people did this. This was popular in the United Kingdom and in Ireland for quite some time. But then the job went away. The job went away because of innovation. Electricity came, and lower-cost, reliable clocks arrived. So innovation isn't new, right? We can all agree on that. But innovation changes things. It changes the way we do things. It adds new value. So it's something that's constant. And so the question I have is there anything different about today? And I'll try to answer that question. So we are potentially moving into a significant societal transformation. All the evidence says we are. In fact, we think it's a fourth industrial revolution. You've been hearing a lot about this, and we hear a lot about it. But you need to know a little bit of background, right? What is all this? Why would we be hitting a fourth industrial revolution? Well, it starts not in the 1900s or the 1800s. The change in society, the beginning of the scientific era, is about 800 years ago. Now, stuff was happening prior to that, of course, but the major thrust starts to happen around the Renaissance. It's headquartered in Florence in Italy. And it's a special time. People are beginning to think critically. They're starting to think and reflect on changes. You know, there was a great disease that destroyed a lot of people during that time, and afterwards they said, you know, we better be more conscious about stuff. We better be more thoughtful about our future. This is an opportunity. And so you move from the Renaissance to the scientific era, and on, and you get to suddenly in the United Kingdom, you get to the first industrial revolution, which is a product ultimately of lots of scientific thinking. So this has been happening for a while. In fact, it happened 4 times in terms of an industrial set of changes. And so when the first industrial revolution happens, the way the world looks prior to that revolution is very different to the world on the other side of the revolution, right? You see the beginning of this idea of factories, right? Factories emerge. And because of factories and steam power, migrations of people change. People start to flock towards these centers and establish homes around the factories because it's a lot more convenient. But lots of other social things happen. You start to see, for example, schools. You start to see the notion of police. These are all new things that we take for granted today. And steam power is the defining element of that first industrial revolution. We get to the second one, and in my view, probably one of the most important revolutions, and it was defined by us discovering and leveraging electricity. If it wasn't for electricity, none of this would be happening. This theater would barely exist, right? Electricity has created what we now call the modern world. And now we're in a third revolution, which is so recent that it's basically happened in my lifetime. And by the way, I'm not that old, right? And this is the digital age, right? You have the emergence of digital computing. A lot of it coming out of, initially, my area of the world, out of Silicon Valley. And it was a response to Sputnik. It was a response to Russia being the first to put a satellite in space. So we had to respond to that. And that really was the impetus for what is now the third industrial revolution. We enter a fourth. And I want to talk about that fourth. By the way, those two revolutions are going to overlap. One doesn't end in order for the other to start. There's a remarkable overlap of these two revolutions. But the fourth, and my argument today, will be that it's very, very different. Now, here's a couple of things that are happening. I think this is one of maybe two charts in my whole presentation, so bear with me. In many ways, this simple chart defines our entire lives today. And this is the increasingly fast processing on a computer and at the same time, the lowering of cost. When I teach my students at university, I often ask them, what was the first really useful use of a microchip? And we guess, and you could probably, you have it in your mind, right, what it might be. It was the calculator. The calculator was the first widely adopted use of the microchip. And so as you move here from the left to the right, you go from the microchip to the fax machine, which almost seemed magical at the time, right? And then you keep going, you get the mainframe computer, then the personal computer, then you get networks, you get operating systems, and then you get the internet in the mid-90s. And then the early 2000s, you get the smartphone, and you get cloud computing starting to emerge, and social computing. And now as you head into 2015 and beyond, we have artificial intelligence. We get into 2020 with quantum computing. Something is going on. There's a direct correlation between the processing power and the cost of microchips and the kinds of things we can do. Let's talk about speed for a second. How long it took for a technology to be adopted by 50 million people. So it took airlines 64 years to reach 50 million users, right? Significant amount of time. Telephone came out, took 50 years to reach 50 million people. It's a bit better, a bit faster. It's getting faster. The mobile phone, including the smartphone, took 12 years to reach 50 million people. WeChat took 1 year. But most remarkably, Pokemon Go reached 50 million people in 19 days. It's getting faster. It's getting faster to distribute technology to lots of people, not only in one region, but all across the world. Okay, so what are the defining characteristics of this fourth industrial revolution? And then, what might it mean for the government experience? We'll unpack that in a moment. So the first thing that's different from all the prior revolutions is the scope of the change, right? The scope. When autonomous vehicles, which I believe will roll out, which will happen in a big way to cities all over the world, the scope will be significant in terms of impacting jobs, the way we design cities, the way we think about and are able to save lives through safer driving. It'll happen on a global scale, and it'll happen pretty fast. And then there's the impact. You know, I live and work in Silicon Valley. It's a pretty unique place, and many of you have visited. We like to write code. We like to program computers, right? And almost every day there's an issue or a challenge where if a configuration is changed in some software in Palo Alto, California, or a new line of code is introduced to a cloud service, people all over the world are immediately impacted. People in India who have business models based around Silicon Valley software. So the impact is significant, right? One line of code, one checkbox, right? We probably have all experiences of downloading some software too soon, and it came with a bug, right? And then we talked about speed. We talked about speed. Today, when a new smartphone operating system comes out, it comes out in lots of places all at once, and it gets distributed on a massive scale really quickly. When I was programming in the IT world 20, 30 years ago, this was unimaginable. Unimaginable? This, this idea that you could distribute millions of copies of software to millions of devices, literally in minutes, in hours, and just within a few days, maybe 100 million devices can be updated. That's new. And finally, convergence. You don't get on-demand passenger cars by just having GPS. You don't get it just by having smartphones. You don't get it by having online payment systems and big data and crowdsourcing. You get it because all of these things are integrated. They converge together to create brand new capabilities. And we'll see more and more of that. So when you think about technology, don't think of it in the singular abstract. Think about it in terms of convergence, right? And I think, and I strongly believe, we're just at the beginning of this concept. That when we start to combine things like artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, vast users of internet, bringing another 3.5 billion people onto the internet, then some magical things are going to happen. I wish I knew what those things were going to be, because I would be a great investor, right? That's the dream. The dream is to know what will happen when all this technology converges, and the new technology converges with it too. In the fourth industrial revolution, robots will fix themselves. Robots will anticipate problems. They already do this, right? We are creating completely new types of production lines that reduce the cost of having a mass-produced production line be out of service. The robots will be kind of thinking. They'll be kind of thinking. The fourth revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, will be about making things differently, right? It's already a pretty old topic, this idea of additive manufacturing, or as we also know it as 3D printing, right? I love this particular example because this is an astronaut who needs a very unique spare part, but he doesn't have to wait for another spaceship to come up and deliver supplies. He simply prints the part within the International Space Station. That's kind of cool, right? If you read old science fiction books, we're sending products to planets to build facilities. It's unlikely we'll do that. We'll manufacture them on the moon and on Mars and when we go interplanetary. Right? That's a whole new way of thinking about manufacturing. We can make things specific to a human being, a human body part at the time of an operation for that person. Now, you might think that the fourth industrial revolution is just about technology. It's very easy to believe that. It's about a lot of different things. In fact, the kinds of things that are changing impact every part of our life. One of them is economics. And if you study economics, as many of you do, everything is derived from economics. Everything, right? So it's a pretty important topic. But if you look out a few years ahead, there are countries that will emerge as great powerhouses relative to where they are today. You can't think of the next few years like things will remain constant. I just picked this particular slide because it's interesting to see that a country like Vietnam will emerge to be a powerhouse, to be one of the 20th largest, most powerful economies in the world by 2050. The Philippines will get up there, and Nigeria will become not only one of the most populated, but one of the biggest economies in the world. That's different than today. And that's important to know that, right? It's important to know that because that's where there's going to be new consumers with new habits and new interests, right? When you think about producing products, you've got to think about that. And finally, in terms of defining this area, which is quite large, and I'm making a very a quick deal of these items, is demographics, is a shift in demographics. The challenge with innovation, and I've been somebody who's been doing, I've been doing innovation type work for about 25 years, is you have to do work for a world that doesn't yet exist. Now think about that for a second, right? That's really hard work. You're making a lot of guesses, right? Now, some of it is guesses, but some of it is looking at trends. Let's look at the trends. And one of the big trends we have to study as we think about the future is demographics. And as you'd imagine from this diagram, this is for the benefit of you folks at the back, Asia continues to grow. Europe remains pretty constant. But the big change in demographics is the continent of Africa. And as we get into the middle of the century and towards the end of the 21st century, Africa becomes a massive powerhouse. A massive powerhouse. We ignore Africa at our peril. And it's really awesome to hear the questions and to see people innovating in that space. They are the early movers, and we should follow them and support them. Okay, so what does this mean to the government experience? Well, it means we have to think about these changes. The introduction of new technology, changing expectations, changing economics, shifting demographics. This is not an easy space, right? Because everything we took for granted is transitioning. Everything we took for granted is changing. And when we think about government offices in many parts of the world, we think of this. This is the Driver Motor Vehicle Center in San Francisco, by the way. And it's still very old school. You have to go in, take a number, sit, a lot of paperwork and stuff. It's very inefficient. This is how many government agencies work in the world when this is the government experience that people actually want. And so you might look at this and say, well, yeah, I get that. I mean, we know that, right? But I look at this and I say, wow, that's an incredible opportunity. It's an incredible opportunity to shift analog services to digital platforms. In fact, a couple of the leading consulting agencies will tell you that it's worth about $2 trillion over the next couple of decades. I say that's pretty good work, right? Pretty good work for people to be involved in. If you're advising a child or a young person about what career to pursue, I like this. I love GovTech, right? Because there's lots of opportunity. Right? We know that in cities around the world, bold leaders are thinking about new ways of delivering services, bringing technology to where people are, making it more convenient, making it more like a consumer experience, and recognizing, too, that people want to be connected, right? There's lots of work to do, and there's lots of investment here. I mean, you've got to build this stuff out. It's worth repeating something I said earlier, which is still half the world woke up this morning with no access to the internet. Sometimes I envy them. You can imagine if you didn't have to wake up and there's 200 emails waiting for you. That's a kind of a nice world. We ain't going back to that. The train has left the station on this topic. And these new technologies are going to displace government workers in different ways, right? We will see broad use of robotics, doing jobs that people used to do. And there's a role for government here. This isn't a private sector initiated or led effort, right? This is an actual robot, by the way, in California. And we need to think about, is this a better experience? Is it improved service? Is it lower cost? Often the answer to those will be yes. What does it mean to us? What does it mean to people, right? We're going to sensorize our environments so we can do things like collect really important data. So we are making data-driven decision-making for the first time. Now, you're an advanced bunch of people on this topic, but I visit many cities in the world where this We're nowhere close to this, right? And so here you have one example of work I did in my town of Palo Alto to implement sensors for actually detecting open or unavailable parking spaces. And the future is going to be about meeting expectations, but also responding to the rapid set of changes. I find often in my community and some of the communities I work with that we are responding to the issues rather than putting in place the rules and regulations and thinking deeply about the implications before we do the change. The trouble is, we won't always have that option, to have that luxury. The government experience will sometimes be catching up. How can we be proactive on this topic? Or if we can't be proactive, can we respond quickly? Can we respond quickly? And the final thing I want to share with you, if I was to talk about the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on government services and the government experience, and not mention climate change, that would be a big mistake. The changing environment, the changing climate in the years ahead will affect everything we do. How we work, how we live, how we play. The data is a bit sobering right now. We're behind the curve. I mean, you get all this, right? There's communities that are already affected by constant flooding or extreme weather events. Governments need to respond. Governments have to create a response that is consistent with expectations and prepares us for this. A completely different government experience based on the changing of the climate. So we're left with a question, what does it mean? Well, in many ways, you need to think about that. I've sort of seeded you with some big thinking on this topic, right? I'll help you with it. The implications of the fourth industrial revolution impact every single person in this room, although you might not recognize it immediately, but they do. It affects your family, your children, your friends, your businesses, the organizations, and government in a very significant way. In a very significant way. Don't trust me on this. Do your own homework. Research it. Get to understand it. You're hearing a lot about it. I suggest do it. Because in each revolution, there are, as I said, winners and losers. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, every one of us wants to be winners. Thank you very much. And I'm going to do something a little unusual here. I'm going to have you part of my selfie. Oh. There you go, wave or something. Terrific. Thank you so much.